morning, everyone. Welcome to the next in our series of retail events. I'm Philippa Dempster. I'm the senior partner here at Freeths, and I head up our retail group. Today, we're joined by Jack Stratten, who's a senior consultant with Insider Trends, one of the leading international trends agencies. Jack has co-authored a couple of reports with us, and we're delighted to have you here, Jack. It's all really important for everybody to know how retailers can thrive in this climate. And today we're going to be getting some tips from Jack to see some of the retailers that have been successful and how perhaps we can adapt and retail is adapting to actually thrive in this climate. So looking forward to hearing from you in a bit, Jack. In addition to that, we're joined by Adam Edwards and Sarah Griggs, two of the team members here at Freeths. That's because part of the report concentrated on some of the legal risks, and two of the biggest, I think, at the moment that the retailers are focusing on is insurance policies, particularly the business interruption insurance policies, and whether they are responding or not. There's been a recent test case, and Adam's going to update on that. And Sarah Griggs, who is going to be talking to us about some of the trends in property, some of the key legal issues at the moment that you need to be watching out for. So we're recording this session. We will be sending it to you afterwards, and we'll be delighted to answer any of your questions. So Jack is going to speak for 20 or 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to hand over to Adam and Sarah and then take questions at the end. There is a little function I'm sure you're familiar with on Zoom to ask any questions that you would like to ask, and we'll pick them up and then I'll ask the relevant people. But please do let us know what your thoughts are. If something comes to you after the event and you want to ask us separately, do email us in or give us a call later. So thank you very much for joining us. And we're delighted to have you here. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Jack.
Great. Thank you very much, Philippa, and good morning to everyone. So I will, I'm going to cover lots of different stuff in the next kind of 15 to 20 minutes, but what I thought I'd start with is just a general little dose of positivity about retail, because I figure we probably all need a bit of good news at the moment. The news in general isn't particularly good at the moment. I'm trying not to read it. But certainly in retail, I actually think there's some positive stories that have been coming out over the last couple of months. A really interesting thing, we work, at Insider Trends, we work fairly closely with the British Retail Consortium. We work closely with them on data reports and with a lot of our retail clients on getting them a kind of first-hand view of on-the-ground data all over the world. They said at the beginning of the pandemic, so back in March, April, British Retail Consortium said that retail will remain below pre-pandemic levels for possibly a year or two. That's how bad this looks. That's the first kind of big point they made based on a lot of their analysis. And a lot of and this isn't just the BRC, this was lots of international organizations. They were saying retail sales will remain below pre-pandemic levels. That's how much the hit will be. But also high streets will take a long time to recover very many of their sales. And actually, there's going to be a real kind of problem for a lot of traditional physical retailers in terms of how they link online and use online retail to manage to kind of grow or rebuild their business. And as probably many of you will be well aware, I think last month in August it was reported that sales after lockdown ended and everything reopened from kind of June onwards, that retail sales were back above pre-pandemic levels actually by the end of July. So there were more retail sales in July than there were in February. Now, a lot of people didn't see that coming. Granted, a big chunk of that happened because of what was happening online. There's no denying that e-commerce has grown immensely, and actually COVID undeniably has given e-commerce an opportunity to grow in ways that perhaps it didn't. It's given all of us here a new way of looking at e-commerce, really. There's loads of people who didn't do online shopping before now doing it. That's the first point. And people who were online shoppers are now shopping online more. But the key point is this is happening for a lot of those traditional retailers with a big physical retail footprint. And they are now starting to sell online for the first time, or they're growing the proportion of their online sales. But importantly, they're using their physical retail stock to help it. So click and collect has increased for most of the biggest physical retailers. They're all doing more click and collect than they were before the pandemic, certainly. So actually the pandemic has helped them to do that. And I think that's partly responsible for some of this growth, stuff like click and collect. So it's not just a success story of online retail. It's actually, in many cases, the fact that retail sales have recovered to a degree. It's a success story of linking online and offline retail. That is massively important for actually the future survival of physical spaces. At Insider Trends, we've been saying for probably 7 or 8 years that we're seeing a kind of increase of online sales that is far more rapid than the increase in physical sales. That's happening all over the world. So there's only one way of viewing that data maybe in 10, 20 years, and that's that physical retail could be in trouble if it doesn't remain useful. So we said the main thing is that physical spaces have to link to online, and they have to do something smart. Click and collect's the obvious point, but there's many other ways that that can happen. And it mostly comes down to data, to be honest, product data, customer data, and being able to smartly link offline and online in lots of different ways. People call it omni-channel retail, but that doesn't really matter. The simplest way of thinking about it is linking the physical to the digital. The fact that's happened so much during the pandemic, I think, is responsible for a big part of the success story. But even just physical retail sales on their own, I think, have recovered surprisingly well. So, it's been about between 10 to 15% sales growth in July and August. And we expected that because, of course, physical retail sales was so low. But that's still a reasonably positive story, actually. And to go a little bit more specifically into maybe some of this good news or what's kind of happening out there, as well as the undeniable reality that a lot of physical retailers are struggling. There's a lot of job losses that have already been announced, and of course there will be more. And of course all of us here will be aware of some large retailers struggling to pay their rents and all kinds of very difficult situations. There have been countless good news stories, and at Insider Trends we've been framing these broadly as kind of 3 different things. There's been 3 parts to the good news stories that have been during COVID in terms of physical retail. Broadly, we call these expansion, diversification, and pivoting. And I'll briefly go through examples that we've found within each of those that show kind of some success stories. Firstly, and surprisingly, expansion. Not many people saw this coming, but actually some brands are using this as an opportunity to expand. This obviously seems quite odd when most retailers are reporting losses or at very least a massive reduction in their profits. But a lot of retailers are using this as an opportunity to start to plan their expansion. Now, the obvious reason for that is that as we're all very aware, retail rents are dropping in many places. And actually the affordability of accessing space has gone right down. And rightly, people are starting to bank on the fact that maybe retail will be a little bit different after coronavirus, but many of the trends that were happening before this will continue. And we can't forget that literally 6 months ago, the big trends we were talking about were that digital brands, digital first brands, online only brands were desperately trying to open physical spaces. This was happening everywhere. The biggest story was probably Glossier, who had a massive expansion plan, mainly involving physical spaces, a lot of the time pop-ups. So Glossier, for anyone who doesn't know, worth about $1 billion, and they're a makeup brand built entirely through social media. In the space of like 5 years, they've grown massively, but they were starting to open physical spaces. Peloton, online only brand, starting to open lots of physical spaces. So Peloton with the exercise bikes. And we've seen this with lots of people. Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's brand, basically started from her kitchen as a newsletter. She's opening physical spaces. There's tons of examples like this. But online only brands were starting to open physical spaces. There's obviously a big reason for that. And there was this big growth of kind of community retail, or brands were being really successful when they were basically using spaces not just to sell stuff, but to create communities, to create spaces to hang out, whether that's having a coffee, whether that's discussing the items you're buying and having a really high-end kind of service, whether that's actually been able to make things. So it could be classes and workshops in stores. So lots of clothing brands were actually running classes on mending or making clothes. This was happening a lot. There was all these trends that were actually pointing towards people being in spaces. That was what everyone was talking about. Actually, in this online world, people are craving really meaningful and interesting experiences in physical spaces. Now, obviously, that's all completely gone, or certainly went during March and April and May. But we really believe it's short-sighted to think that those trends, and that were driven by consumer trends, people wanting these physical interactions, are just going to completely disappear forever. coronavirus is going to have an impact, of course, on how we behave as humans. And it's going to be a little while, even if a vaccine comes into play or coronavirus becomes more of a part of everyday life, where, of course, a lot of us are going to remain resistant. Some of those old habits are going to take a while to come back. But it's dangerous to assume that they absolutely won't. And that's the thing that's driving some brands wanting to actually use this as an opportunity to expand. This is happening. We're working with a brand I can't name currently, but they're basically quite a large yarn and haberdashery brand, mainly online, who operate throughout Europe. They're a Danish brand. They have plans to open 60 to 70 stores within the next year or two. They want at least 12 to 15 of those to be in the UK, including a flagship. They've got big plans for a flagship in London. When they started discussing that with us, we were kind of surprised. Since we've spoken to them, we've probably spoken to 2 or 3 other retailers who similarly are talking to us at a conceptual level about what their concept spaces should be in the UK, because they want to build new, interesting spaces that react to the pre-pandemic trends, not what's going on now. They're not planning spaces with everyone wearing masks. They're planning really interesting community spaces. So this is interesting, the fact that that's starting to happen, but I absolutely think it's because they're seeing it as an opportunity. They think, well, if it's more affordable, now's the time. And it reminded me of something that happened in the last recession. Lidl and Aldi, some of the senior people in both in those businesses, they've said quite clearly that the biggest reason that they took a big foothold in the UK was the aftermath of the 2008 recession, because they expanded massively during that period. And they did it because they were buying up loads of spaces that were losing their tenants. Basically, they were buying up cheap spaces because they knew that that was the time to kind of make their investments. I think we could definitely see some other newcomers to certain sectors. Maybe there'll be established brands. So Next, for example, I recently read, are looking to buy up the beauty counters in Debenhams, because obviously Debenhams stores are largely closing down. Next are actually trying to take over the beauty counters, because Next have a massively kind of renewed focus on beauty, because they've been doing really well online for beauty products. That's been one of their biggest growth areas. So they want a physical presence for their kind of beauty brands. And they're going to do that in those spaces. So there's lots of different examples of this happening. But Lidl and Aldi basically said that recessions are the time to expand. And they've pointed to that as one of their biggest reasons of them being successful in the UK. And it kind of actually matches up with the data that 2008 to 2010 was the point that they really started to make inroads. And they did have a very aggressive expansion plan. I think we all need to be aware that this could be a period in the next year or two where we see lots of incumbents, lots of new players. It might be startups, might be established brands, but brands who are able just to have enough cash to be able to invest. It might seem like a risk, but actually I don't think they'll see it that way. So I've heard lots of stories about brands either talking about expanding or certainly making some concrete plans. The second point, and I think this is important for everyone in terms of being ready for the next stage of this pandemic or the future, is definitely what we call pivoting. Pivoting in the simplest sense, I'll give a good example of this. There's a hotel in Brooklyn, New York, called the Wythe Hotel. And they very early on in the pandemic started to rent out their hotel rooms as office spaces. So for home workers who were losing their minds, and obviously there's a lot of people who just live in apartments in Brooklyn with families or whatever, they started to open up their hotel rooms for anywhere between $50 and $200 a day. And they'd give you, room service, and you could run your little business operation from one of those rooms. Seems like quite a simple idea, but it was massively important in them surviving. They've spoken since and said actually they managed to have something like 50 to 75% occupancy during the early stage of the pandemic, when no one was coming to New York, obviously, when no one was using those rooms. And why I like that example is that is a great example of a pivot. It's basically looking at the business and looking at the challenges and saying, well, we've got to think a bit creatively and think on our feet, but what can we offer? What can we do? Now, we saw in March and April lots of businesses where they could, and where, as Freeths the guys from Freeths might be able to touch on later, where they were legally able to kind of change the function, the legal function of a retail space. They would suddenly maybe changed it to what people call a dark store or a fulfillment area, where basically a store from being customer facing to just being somewhere that fulfills online orders. People can come and collect them, or staff can actually can change their role, can almost become delivery drivers or deliverers to the local area or whatever. So lots of brands have pivoted that way, and that's been a really smart move. They've done more, they've put a lot of investment into e-commerce, they've made more sales online, and use their stores as click and collect hubs or delivery hubs. Lots of benefits in using those stores, because if you're a brand that maybe has a few hundred stores throughout the UK, much better to use those as your kind of delivery base than maybe 3 or 4 fulfillment centers that are in awkward locations throughout the country. So that's kind of the one of the main ways that people have been pivoting. There's all kinds of other things that people could do. I think I mentioned in the last webinar, but it's actually been really successful. John Lewis are basically using their in-store staff to fulfill online customer questions. So if a customer is online shopping and they come across an item that they want to query or something they're not clear about, they can speak to one of John Lewis's renowned in-store staff members in a particular department. So you're looking at electronics item, you can be on the phone with someone in the electronics department while you're looking at that product. You can ask a question and the guy, John Lewis, just gets a little message on their app or on the iPad, and they can answer it there and then. And it's brilliant because actually John Lewis, of course, they sell almost half of their stock online now anyway, but they didn't want to get rid of their staff. They're renowned for those brilliantly knowledgeable staff members, and it's made use of those people. But also those people are now actually really incentivized to help to sell stuff online. So I've seen lots of brands, by the way, doing their own version of that. There are third-party tech companies fulfilling that concept. But of course, what you're really talking about is a messaging service, or Skype, to be honest. It could be anything. So I've even heard of smaller brands doing that, where they're in their store, and when a customer's on their website, they just get the customer to do a video call with them, and they can talk them through a product or talk them through a service. So pivots have been a real, and I mentioned one just there with Next, but Next have actually been reasonably, their sales have dropped, but they're still, they announced the other day that they're on track. They think even if there's another lockdown, they're on track to turn a profit of £200 million at the end of the year. That is remarkable for a brand that is by no means one of the leading e-commerce retailers. That is a brand that switched, they were doing fairly well e-commerce wise, but not brilliantly, massively relied on physical retail, but they've really pushed click and collect. They've really sorted out their supply chain. They've got their data in order. They've turned at least a few of their stores or parts of those stores into kind of fulfillment areas. And they've done so well that they now, as I mentioned, are looking at maybe a little bit of expansion. And they're learning from what they're selling online. So they saw that beauty was doing well online. So rather than opening completely new broad Next stores, they're looking at opening beauty areas. I've heard the same thing about Marks and Spencer's. Marks and Spencer's have said their baby clothes during the pandemic and before have been absolutely selling out like crazy. It's kind of become a real big thing in the UK. If you're about to have a child, that you're never going to be able to get anything from M&S. People are buying everything up way in advance. But M&S have been so successful with that, they're using that to inform what they're going to do in their physical spaces. So they're saying in a lot of their spaces, the baby areas are going to be bigger. They're going to maybe grow into some of the men's and women's sections that aren't doing as well. Also, they've got plans to start to potentially open kind of baby and toddler only sections or even kind of micro stores in certain parts of the country that just do that. So their online sales are actually informing their physical store strategy. So tons of interesting stuff going on in terms of pivoting. But I think going back to that hotel example, it's actually, it's not so much looking at what everyone else is doing, but almost just looking at your own business creatively and thinking, well, how can we use this space differently and quickly? How can we adapt fast and in an affordable way? What I hope is people have learnt lessons from the success stories and also the bad stories from the first lockdown to prepare a little bit better for the second one. And I think it is about that, creative ways that a business can pivot. And the other thing I mentioned was diversification. And really that's all about, I think that comes down actually to what we learned from e-commerce. It's about being able to diversify the business and be able to do different things for different customers. And that actually the most important thing for that, and I've touched on it a couple of times, is data. What the large retailers are recognizing is they hear trends analysts and strategists like myself talking about how important data is, how important omni-channel retail is and linking up offline and online. But they say on most occasions, the problem is our data. We don't have everything connected. We don't have the dots connected. So we have a legacy CRM system that our staff use. And then we have our website. And these two things don't talk, they don't connect, because one was built in the 1990s. And then we've heard all of the great tech startups that you're talking about over here. But they don't connect, so our data isn't ready, our products aren't shipped. So we're scared of pushing online orders because actually we don't think we're going to be able to fulfill them very well. We think problems are going to occur because of the fact that our data isn't in order. Now, this is a big problem for omnichannel. It's probably the number one thing. And my biggest tip for that, or my biggest kind of takeaway from what's been going on, is that actually what you have to do if you can is try to start small scale. So start to, if you're a brand, or if brands are looking at the idea, for example, of changing some of their stores to dark stores or fulfillment centers because the footfall's so low. Some brands have tried to do that in a wholesale way, and of course they've come across legal challenges or delivery challenges or whatever. I think the key to all of this is being able to just test it in one area. What I'm surprised about consistently is how few brands just run with the idea of just testing a concept in one location. Instead, they're kind of trying to go mass market immediately. We saw this in the pandemic a lot. So many big brands tried to scale their online ordering rapidly. So the classic example is in grocery. Ocado have done actually quite a lot of damage to their business. They were the leading online food delivery business in the UK. They had the biggest market share. That market share has dropped dramatically, and they're now desperately trying to claw it back. One of the big reasons was they tried to scale immediately. They were too confident. And meanwhile, other brands like Tesco and Sainsbury's, who've really grown their market share of online grocery ordering, they were really smart about how they used those physical spaces to their kind of own strengths. But what they did is they did it gradually. They didn't immediately open up 500,000 delivery slots. If they were honest, they had a really good system they built online. It was very clear from the beginning, you're in a waiting area, we can't guarantee that you'll get this delivery. Whereas Ocado was still very much advertising this idea that anyone can get an Ocado delivery slot rapidly. It's a simple thing that I'm talking about there, but it's kind of like the difference between going mass market too quickly and actually testing in a small area. So if data is the key thing, what you have to do, I think, is start to try to maybe just improve the data related to a small section of products or one particular store. So test omni-channel at one particular store and see how it works. Get the digital team and the physical team working together on one location and just get the supply chain right in that location and learn some lessons from it. Because what can happen is you go mass market and then you fall into the hole that lots of brands have done. And I'm picking on Ocado, but there's tons of brands who suffered in the first lockdown because they were too aggressive, too quickly, got too excited by the potential of new online shoppers, didn't have their supply chain stuff in order. And that's kind of, broadly, I really wanted to touch on that concept of diversification, expansion, and pivoting. So three of the big things. The only other thing I wanted to say, which I think is important and relevant to everyone here, is that I'm sure we've all been reading loosely a lot about how our working habits are affecting retail. So in other words, most of us are working from home, and that's meant that retail is struggling in some of our biggest cities, and being probably the best example of that. But actually, there's been a bit of a boost in footfall in local high streets. So commuter towns have had a bit of a boost in their high streets, and certainly retail outlet centres have played a big role in some of the increased sales in retail outlet centres, town centres, doing quite well. Local high streets are doing well too. So I think that's been a good story to come out of it. Again, I think it's dangerous to predict the long term of that, because we don't yet know how much our working habits will change. I think a lot of people are thinking this is a complete shift to remote working. I think the safer bet is a partial shift, that in the future we'll probably work from home more than we used to. But I do think that we'll still be returning to our cities to work and to meet in teams. Great, because I do think a lot of people recognizing there is something missing, certainly in a kind of collaboration, from a collaboration point of view. So I think that those local high streets are a good news story, but probably for me, one of the most interesting things is there's been a slight re-emergence of pop-up retail. Pop-up retail was a big thing like 10, 15 years ago, and everyone was saying pop-up retail is how we're going to revive empty spaces when they close. We're going to have to be more creative, all of us involved at every end of the retail process, in helping new retailers, maybe online-only retailers, small retailers, local retailers, whatever, to use these spaces as pop-ups, somewhere to go and test their products or their business model, whatever, in a physical space, maybe just for a month at a time. really hit London in quite a big Carnaby Street was all pop-up retail. Then bigger brands came in, and the same thing happened at Box Park in Shoreditch. It was all initially startups, and then big retailers moved in. But the drop in rents, and I think maybe an eagerness from certain landlords and town planners and councils to breathe some life back into high streets, has meant this conversation is back on the table. Pop-up retail is a big discussion. And I think it's been led also by large retailers talking about this. So Nike, Adidas, Glossier, as I mentioned earlier, Peloton, I think even Next for some of their beauty concepts, and John Lewis have talked about this. Everyone's talking about smaller spaces, firstly, so micro spaces, but also pop-up spaces. And they're saying, even maybe large kind of Debenham style stores that have closed, there's a big discussion going on about how we can maybe turn those larger spaces into lots of little pop-up spaces within them, or almost, kind of a place to house startups, which is a concept that's been around for a little while, but hasn't entirely taken off. But they realised where it has happened. So there was a great story about Totnes in Devon. They have a lot of pop-ups, a much higher percentage of independent retailers there than in a lot of high streets throughout the country. And equally, it's seen a real increase in footfall as a result of that. It's believed that independent retail sort of boom there. Pop-up is a big opportunity, I think, maybe to come out of this pandemic. If there's going to be an eagerness to fill some of these spaces that are going to open up, and there's a growth in e-commerce brands, so a lot of companies that are growing online who are going to want an opportunity to go to physical retail, but of course not spend an absolute fortune. I think collectively, the whole kind of world of retail, we need to think of ways that we can help pop-up retail to happen. Yes, that might be working with big brands and giving them an opportunity to maybe expand a new range or a new concept in a small space for a limited time. But it should definitely also be for smaller retailers and newcomers, and finding a way that it can be affordable. Maybe those spaces can actually offer everything they need. So it could have the POS, the legal aspects and many different aspects sorted for them, so they can literally just go in, sell their stuff and see how it goes for a month and leave again. Because I think what an amazing thing that would be for the retailer, for the emergence of new companies and creating a more competitive and interesting marketplace, but most importantly for consumers, because all surveys point towards the fact that this is what consumers want in their high streets. They want independent businesses as much as possible. They want local businesses. They love startups. They love new ideas, and they love it when their high street is full of new pop-up businesses. And the great thing, probably the most important thing about pop-ups, is that they can change so regularly. So every month, if that particular space changes, it gives you a reason to keep going back to your high street, because you don't know what's going to be there from month to month. So it can actually really give you that sort of inspiration and almost that emotional engagement that is definitely not entirely fulfilled by online retail. Online retail, as sophisticated as it can be, 90% of the time is about convenience and transactions. It doesn't fulfill the emotional. And I think physical retail will always be the key to doing that, to fulfilling the emotional part of retail. And I believe that pop-ups could have a real future. And I think a lot of people, perhaps on this webinar, from what I understand, might have a role to play in that, about how we can facilitate a future for retail where smaller brands and startups can go and try out physical spaces on this limited thing. And I think one thing I'd like everyone, if they get an opportunity, if there's one thing to go and look up, there's a store in New York called Showfields. I went there in January for a safari, which just seems like a world away just before the pandemic, to think that I was in New York taking people around very cool concept stores. Seems like it didn't even happen, but hopefully I'll be back when this all finishes. But it was Showfields is one of the most incredible stores I've ever seen. So look it up. I won't tell you too much, but the whole store is built around this idea. It's a department store for startups, and it has 50 different retailers there pretty much every month, and they provide everything that retailer needs: the staff, the POS, everything. And it's been unbelievably successful. Pretty much all the startups that have gone in there have turned a profit, which is crazy. But also the footfall's incredible. It's it's been consistently one of the busiest stores in New York since it opened. But the whole concept is like a department store for pop-ups, and there's a lot of very cool brands in there or whatever. But just seeing that space and how it looks and the kind of excitement, it's like pure retail theatre. And for me, I just think if we could have a bit more of the Showfields model in our high streets, in our shopping malls, even in our out-of-town centres, I think there's real desire out there, especially after this period where people, as good as e-commerce is, people are going to be pretty sick of the speed and convenience and the kind of non-emotional nature of online retail. It's become so slick that we're all getting a little bit bored with the, oh, you bought this, so you should buy that mentality. We want to be inspired. I think sometimes it's almost too repetitive. There's a lot of surveys pointing, by the way, towards that. It's called, I read a report from McKinsey on this idea of the grocery glut. And it's that actually we're getting really bored of how good online shopping is for food, because what's happening is we end up buying the same stuff every month. And we look at our fridges and we just feel a bit bored because we're like, well, I can do my food shop really fast. It's all great. But actually, I'm missing that feeling of being in that, slowly walking around the supermarket, looking at the end of an aisle and seeing a completely new product. E-commerce just doesn't do that. And all the tech experts will point towards how it can, but it doesn't. And it's not just in grocery, that happens in all sectors. It cannot fulfill that feeling of just wandering slowly around the store and being inspired by something, or the staff member, or the aesthetic of the space. So do look at Showfields, because it's probably one of the best stores I've been in for a long time. And I think there's a lot to learn from it for anyone involved in the retail world. And hopefully when all of this blows over, you'll all get the chance to go and see it if you haven't already, because it's really amazing. That, I think, is everything I kind of wanted to cover. So I'm going to pass you back to Philippa, and then the Freeths guys are importantly going to cover some more useful, practical, technical stuff, as Philippa mentioned, around employment and insurance and the legalities. So thank you very much. And maybe I'll answer a couple of questions as well if Philippa has any.
Great. Thanks so much, Jack. That was really inspiring. It's good to have some good news stories. I'm definitely going to have a look at Showfields. I like the idea of the pop-ups, and I agree with you that retail is great online, but it's not great in that you just want to be inspired, and it's not that you can't beat actually going into a store and seeing something new and really wanting to buy it. So I agree with you entirely. Sarah, that brings me on to property and stores. What do retailers now, what are they looking out for, and what should they be looking out for, bearing in mind what Jack's been telling us about the need for flexibility?
Good morning, everyone. I'm a partner in our real estate team in London. I agree with Jack. We're seeing positive signs as well in the retail market, particularly with inquiries from foreign retailers coming into the UK, where they're seeing that stores are more affordable now with rents adjusting. Even 6 months ago, some stores may not have been affordable, but now they can get into those areas that weren't previously affordable for them. So it's really good to see some positive signs and hear what Jack's has shared with us as well. I think there's two aspects really for me to cover. The first is how really retailers should be protecting their business going forward in the event of a future crisis and lockdown, and we're still in that period at the moment. And secondly, really looking at those leases and building in flexibility for the business to adapt and pivot, as Jack mentioned, to adjust to these situations and challenges that we face in the current situation and future crises. So looking firstly at protecting ourselves going forward in leases, I think the primary consideration is really looking at the rents, and we touched on this in the last webinar. There was a shift towards turnover rents pre-COVID, but I think that whole shift has been accelerated by the experience of the last 6 months. So I think increasingly to share the pain, so to speak, between the retailers and the landlords, retailers will be increasingly pushing for those turnover rents, whether that's turnover only or a low base rent plus a turnover top up. That just shares the risk of future forced closure between the retailers and the landlords. Landlords will be certainly pushing for a minimum rent plus a turnover top up, and of course the retailers will be looking for pure turnover only rents. It's also worth considering from a retailer perspective, capping those turnover rents. So if sales fly through the roof in the future, just having a cap on that so that you're not then paying more than market rent, but that comes down to the commercial negotiation at the time. Thinking about turnover rents as well, one of the key considerations really is how online sales impact on the turnover rent calculations. Landlords obviously will be want to capture any sales connected with the store in those turnover rent calculations. particularly where those online orders are satisfied from stock in store, like Jack was mentioning, is a potential opportunity for retailers where they're forced to close those stores to customers to use those as fulfillment hubs for the online sales. Landlords particularly will want to recover some of the benefit of those sales through the turnover rents, whereas retailers will be saying, hang on a minute, that sale isn't connected with the store in any way, it's just coincidental that we're satisfying that online order from stock that we hold in store. And when the stores are open and trading, it's down to the retailer to ensure that the store is adequately stocked to satisfy both the online and the physical sales. But again, that comes down to commercial negotiation at the time, and is an interesting discussion at the moment. And a further aspect of that is, how do we capture the online sales from devices in store or customers' own devices? Should they be included in the turnover rent, or should they not, because they're not actually rung through the tills? So another challenging discussion to be agreed at the time. I think the other point that is key for retailers looking at leases going forward is, traditionally we know that the rent would not be suspended where there is forced closure of the stores due to a pandemic situation. We know now that retailers are all obviously pushing for a suspension of rent to protect themselves in these circumstances if there is a future lockdown. Where there's a turnover only rent, the risk there will not be the rent payable if the store is closed. But where you're on even a low base rent or open market rent, it's really essential to have some sort of rent suspension in those circumstances. And whether that extends to service charge as well, again, comes down to commercial negotiation. But what we're hearing from a lot of the shopping centre landlords is, due to lockdown, those service charges will be lower anyway. So that then moves me on to actually, what should we also be doing going forward to build in greater flexibility in the leases to enable the business to react to future crisis. The key points that Jack touched on as well are space sharing. So a lot of retailers anyway require flexibility in their leases to share occupation on an informal basis with concessionaires without having to go to the landlord for consent. So we may see a move in the future towards retailers sharing space with other retailers that complement their brand and work together. Again, that's reducing the rental liability as well for the retailer who takes the larger space by actually sharing space and bringing experiences into store as well with through other occupiers. The second point is really to look at the flexibility of user in leases. So traditionally in retail leases, they can only be used for retail use, and landlord's consent is required for any change of use from the specified retail use in the lease. I think going forward, we could see retailers pushing for greater flexibility in that, which is reflected again in what the government has done in relaxing the planning laws, opening up the planning use classes to not only include retail in a single class, but also including restaurants, offices, some professional services as well, which means that planning consent is no longer required for change of use within those different uses. Previously, you would have required planning consent to change use from retail to office. So that relaxation should, I think, will then filter through into the leases, enabling retailers within the terms of the leases with landlords to change use from retail use and perhaps have other uses in store that aren't traditionally pure retail use. So it'll be interesting to see how the market develops with the relaxation of those planning laws. But it's also worth considering, where you are paying an open market rent, what impacts that wider user clause could have on rent review, where you obviously want to seek input from a rent review surveyor. So I think that they're really the key points that I think need to be considered in leases going forward to protect the business and also allow the business to adapt to the changing challenges that they face.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Adam, I'd like to bring you in on this point, because we all know that retailers and a whole range of businesses have traditionally taken up business interruption insurance. And when there's a situation like this, everybody reaches for it and thinking that that's going to be the panacea. But unfortunately, we also know that whenever you insure something, it's always quite tricky to get the money off insurers, whether it's in your home life or in your business life. So tell us a little bit about the test case that's been going through on business interruption and whether and how you can actually access that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for that introduction, Pippa. So I head up the financial services regulation team here at Freeths. I'm going to start with a bit of a confession, given what Philippa's just said. I suppose I'm gamekeeper turned poacher. I used to act a lot for insurers, and I was one of those lawyers who would spend hours finding reasons why insurers shouldn't pay out claims. I'm now on the other side of the fence and predominantly act for policyholders. As an insurance lawyer, it's an interesting time. So as Philip has alluded to, there has been a test case that's been going through the High Court, and we've recently had judgment on. And just quickly by way of background, the test case was brought by the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority. And what they did is that, well, they have lots of powers, the authority, sometimes too many, some might argue. And one of their powers is that they can, where they believe that there is consumer detriment or that the markets aren't operating fairly, they have a power to intervene and bring test cases. So what they did is they became aware that many policyholders, as Philippa has said, particularly in the retail sector with the enforced closures, but also in the hospitality sector, we've been speaking to people who are part of an association for people who own holiday sort of lets and things like that. Lots and lots of different businesses have been impacted, and they did look to their policies, and a lot of insurers simply had a blanket stance of saying no to any claims. And in fact, we saw several worrying instances of insurers sending out what, quite frankly, misleading sort of preemptive correspondence to their policyholders to say, effectively, don't bother even trying to claim, you're not covered. So the FCA became aware of what was going on and made the decision to take a test case under its powers. It estimated that something like 370,000 policyholders were potentially affected. So you can see there was a real need for something to happen, for somebody to step in. So the FCA entered into a framework agreement with 8 insurers who held or who had written a number of these policies that were held by the policyholders. They agreed a set of facts. They agreed the issues to be determined. And it was also agreed, and this is quite important given what's happened recently, that the judgment will be open to appeal with the bypass of the Court of Appeal going straight to the Supreme Court, obviously the highest court in the land. In addition to the FCA and the insurers being parties, there are also 2 intervening parties, something called the Hospitality Action Group and then the Hiscox Action Group, which represented around 400 policyholders with Hiscox insurance. The case was brought on an expedited basis, so it was issued in around June, it commenced in around June, and the hearing actually took place in July, which is frankly unheard of in the High Court. The judgment was issued 9 days ago on the 15th of September, and as many of you probably have seen in the press, it was positive for policyholders. I think the press has probably been a little bit too enthusiastic. I think it's very positive for certain types of policyholders who hold certain types of policies. It's not good news for everybody, and there are still a lot of issues that haven't been sort of ironed out or resolved fully by the test case. Since the judgment came out, the FCA has written a Dear CEO letter. Now, this is a letter that goes to regulated firms, in this case insurers, and says, effectively, we expect you to act in this way. And they have said to insurers that if you've got any policyholders who hold a policy that is not going to be subject to a point under appeal, we don't know which points are going to be appealed, if any, then they should process claims and look again at those claims they've declined, and if appropriate, move to settlement as quickly as possible. Great news. If the policy is subject to a point under appeal, then the insurers still need to continue to progress the claim. So what that means is they need to get in the evidence of losses, et cetera, to make sure that, subject to the point that if it's a sort of a discrete point of law, subject to that discrete point of law being decided by the Supreme Court, they are ready to either pay out or just reach a final decision as quickly as possible once the Supreme Court hands down its judgment. I think it's important to understand that, as I've said, that it's not entirely positive for all policyholders. And the reason for that is that the court essentially broke down the policy wordings into three categories. So going back to basics, and I'm sure many of you know this already, but business interruption insurance isn't generally bought as a standalone cover. Normally it is an extension to a property damage cover. So that means that the main business interruption cover is intended to kick in where there's been damage to, for instance, retail premises and stock has been lost, etc. So you can then, as an extension to that, bring a claim for loss of profit or increased costs of working that you incurred as a result of the damage. Clearly here with COVID, there isn't damage in the normal sense to the premises. So what the court was considering were clauses where there is non-damage extensions. And these can be, they break it down into three categories. There are disease clauses. Now these are clauses that say, if there was a disease of a certain type within a certain geographical radius of your premises, and that resulted in losses, then you're covered. There are what are called public authority action, or often denial of action, prevention of access clauses. And these simply say that if there was some sort of public authority action within a certain vicinity of your premises or geographical limit of your premises that prevented you getting access to your premises and you suffered loss, again, you're covered. And then the final category was hybrid, which is kind of a strange combination of disease and public authority. So it has to be that there's been a disease, and as a result of that, public authority has done something that's caused you loss. On disease clauses, overall, the judgment is good news for policyholders. Unfortunately, it's probably the bit that insurers are most likely to appeal, because their exposure there is going to be huge if the judgment isn't appealed. There's still, the court effectively set high-level principles. There are still some points that you need to look at on a case-by-case basis. So you still need to prove the disease was in the locality, etc. Those sorts of things. And then on the public authority side, unfortunately, the news wasn't as good. It's much more nuanced. There's still the possibility of getting some cover. And the court has drawn distinctions between things like the government guidance that we were first seeing around, you know, you should stay at home if you can, all that sort of slightly, if I can, woolly kind of stuff that they were saying. And then the more certain restrictions that came into force around, I think it was around the 23rd of March, that actually said, you know, non-essential retail, etc., needs to be closed now. So where we are, I think, is unfortunately, we're a long way from absolute certainty. The FCA doing what they've done has sort of probably accelerated things somewhat. I think there'll be a lot of policyholders who've still got a long road to travel with their insurers, unfortunately. In terms of looking at the quantification of losses, I think it's actually really interesting to hear Jack talking about pivoting and adaptability, because that is actually something that's going to become a factor in working out your losses. It's not strictly speaking retail, but a good example is in the hospitality sector, so in food and drink. So if you were running a restaurant and you were able to start doing takeout, for instance, then that could be seen by the insurers as being something that you reasonably should have done to minimize your losses. And they may well run arguments to say, well, look, other people were doing it, you could have done it, so we're not going to pay out all of your losses because that would reduce the loss you suffered. And then I think there's still a long way to go. I think it is positive. I think the bad news is that obviously we're looking now, from the sounds of it, at a sort of second wave, potentially a second lockdown. Where you've got something like this that is something that comes and goes, it becomes very tricky with insurance policies because they only run for a year at a time. So what we're seeing at the moment is a hardening in the market. So a lot of policies are now expressly excluding COVID or COVID-related diseases and closures. So I think it's going to become uneconomic or impossible to cover specifically for COVID. But it doesn't mean to say that going forward, there's not going to be ways of insuring against pandemics, generally speaking.
Thank you very much, Adam. That's really helpful. Good news, as you say, but it's good that they've accelerated the procedure, but still a way to go to get some real clarity. So now we would like to invite people to ask as many questions as you'd like. And I've got my first one on screen from Kate. And she'd like to know, how can a small boutique retailer tailor their business in accordance to the advice we've given with a very limited cash flow? Jack, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. And I think, I suppose that a couple of assumptions I'll have to make about the business, and obviously this might vary in accordance to the type of customer you have, and also what kind of position your e-commerce business is in already. But yeah, our advice to almost any small retailer in this situation, any small retailer with a physical space and not doing too much online, is whatever money you do have, pour it into online retail. I think that is really, really important, because as much as the online marketplace for whatever you're selling is completely saturated, in the short term, you have to protect yourself against the very obvious point that there are potentially going to be lots of situations in the near future where you either can't sell or people just don't want to come into your shop. That's the short-term reality. So more money into e-commerce. Specifically, I think for smaller businesses, the key is trying too hard to build your e-commerce around or improve what you already have. Because what you have to remember is, and I'm not just talking about Amazon here, but tons of other retailers and certain kind of online only boutique retailers, their platforms are becoming so good and so sophisticated that it's incredibly hard for you to go off and build your own website or improve your own website in a way that could compete with the kind of speed and convenience and sophistication that most of us rely. It's the Amazon effect. We're also used to buying stuff on Amazon and how quick and easy it is. It's like your problem is that even if that buying process on your site is even a few seconds slower, trouble, because it's almost a part of expectations that it is incredibly fast and incredibly simple. Find what you have, or building something from the ground up. Try and team up with third-party companies. So the best example I could give would be Shopify. I think Shopify are excellent with small retailers. They have great models where they can just take a kind of share of a percentage of a sale. They also offer, I think, a month's free trial at the moment, and they can build your website incredibly quickly. So I think Shopify is a no-brainer, but also doing what you have to do in terms of selling in the biggest marketplaces that already exist. So if you don't already, putting everything you have on the major places like Amazon, selling through Instagram. You have, buy it now buttons built into Instagram now. So for a small amount of money, you can put a paid post up that has a button, so you can have an item of clothing or whatever. Someone could click on it and go straight to be able to buy it on your website. That isn't expensive to do. You're talking about maybe a very small amount of investment to be able to do that. So kind of diversify what you're doing online, sell on social, sell through online marketplaces like Amazon, and maybe try and look for Shopify or similar businesses who basically will build your online platform, but importantly, they'll build it in a way that looks and feels like something much, much, I think with limited cash flow, that's where your money has to go, because of course, a lot of what I was talking about earlier pivots to do with click and collect, and that and diversifying what you do in your physical space is, of course, requires a lot more investment, and that's, I would imagine, far too risky. So I think a smaller amount of investment in online is the way to go.
Great, thanks, Jack. Another one for you. Are there any new ideas in physical retail at the moment because of the crisis that people should really look at adopting?
Sorry, Philippa, I lost part of that because of a connection problem, I think. Could you ask that again?
Yeah, are there any physical, anything new and exciting in physical retail that's happening because of the crisis in physical spaces at the moment?
Yeah, interesting thing has come. So a lot of people will be aware of queue management. I'm sure most of us have experienced that. There's been lots of those kinds of sin managed through the app. So quite a few retailers, you can find dozens of these. Nike have been doing it, where basically you're encouraged to download the app of the retailer. And then when you're outside the store, it can geolocate where you are and it will tell you when it's your turn to go in, basically. So it manages the queue in a kind of COVID-proof way. So there's lots of people in the store. So it's got a functional aspect. But the reason that I think it's really, really powerful is that that's got you to download the app. That's got you, something that retailers talk about all the time is really hard, is actually getting customers to download an app in the first place. Because once you have that, you can do all kinds of great stuff around personalized marketing. When you go into a store, if you have the app, it can start to tell you about things going on in that store, or you can kind of maybe have all kinds of services in store that are targeted through the app. So an app can be a really powerful tool for a retailer, but it's really, really hard to actually get people to download it. So queue management has, for a lot of brands, actually been a way of getting people to download the app in the first place. But there's other things, like I've noticed in the US, Target do a thing where they have an app where people can queue outside one of their stores and you'll be told when it's your turn. And in the time that you wait, it then leads you on to tell you the special offers that are in the store on that particular day. Because you have the app, it asks you for a certain amount of information to try and get an understanding of what you like and you don't like. And it can actually personalize those recommendations. So it will say, from past purchases, we know that you're into these kinds of products. Well, guess what? They're discounted today. Head to the back of the store and we can show you where they are. Or you can even say, before you go in, you could maybe book in for some, I don't know, like a VIP service, or you meet a particular staff member. The point being, it could be anything, but that app allows that store to personalize what it does and tell you what's going on in the store on that day. And that's happening quite a lot. And I think that's really powerful. And we'll see that carry on after COVID, because actually we don't mind maybe queuing for a couple of minutes if in that couple of minutes we can be told lots of things about what's going on in the store to save us time. How many of us traditionally just wander around the store looking for something, and actually while you're in the queue, it can almost plan your journey before you go in. So I think that's really interesting, and it's not an expensive thing now either. Queue management tools, I've heard about tiny independent businesses building them themselves, so it's not an expensive thing. There's third-party companies doing it as well. Tons of local high streets have been doing it. Like I know hairdressers. I've read about some great things going on with hairdressers where they've built their own little queue management tool, put a bench outside and people just wait and the app tells them when to go in, which is really lovely, incredibly easy to build. So yeah, I think that's a really exciting thing.
I think, well, that sounds very useful. Thank you. One other question that we had from Kate was really around the negotiations with landlords. Sarah, if I can just bring you in on this. How's the CVA process and landlords and going on at the moment in terms of, is the CVA process still putting a lot of pressure on people, or are people able to negotiate better deals without having to reach to tools like that?
I think it's been a struggle for, or hard work really, for retailers and landlords to reach agreement on rent concessions in the current climate. I think it's a business decision which involves numerous considerations really as to whether a retailer would want to go through the CVA process to reduce rents or not. But we have seen some high profile CVAs with the likes of New Look using that as a tool to keep the business healthy and going, but also to shift their rents to turnover rents. So I think there's lots of considerations around the CVAs that you'd need specialist advice on. But as regards to negotiations with landlords for sort of rent-free to cover the period of closure, it's really, from a retailer perspective, looking at if you've got anything to offer the landlord, like pushing back a break date or extending the lease term, so the landlord's getting some value back for the rent-free that they are giving you. But I know it's been really tough negotiations from both retailer and landlord's perspective, several months of hard negotiations to reach agreements, so you're certainly not alone.
And what is the current position with sort of moratoriums and landlords being able to take action to force you out of premises?
So it's recently been extended. The government have extended the protection preventing landlords forfeiting leases for non-payment of rent until the end of December, which is great news for retailers. We're coming up to a big quarter. We don't want other retailers going under, and we need the government's support for retailers. They've extended that currently until the 31st of December. As regards the statutory demands and winding up petitions, we're keeping our ear to the ground to find out if the ban on serving statutory demands and winding up petitions will also be extended, but I haven't checked today, I have to admit, but certainly we haven't heard anything concrete on that as yet.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we've had our hour, and thank you all for really interesting and informative conversations and sharing experiences. Jack, it's been a pleasure hosting you as well, and I'm sure everybody on this webinar today would like to thank everybody that's been present to say, you know, you've given us a lot of insights here. For those of you who are listening and would like to ask further questions, I'm sorry we've run out of time today. We will come back to the questions that you've asked us in the chat section anyway, for sure. But if anything else occurs to you in the next 24 hours, week or whatever, do feel free to get in touch. And I know, Adam, on the insurance side, you're very much at the moment keeping abreast of things and we'll have regular updates. So anybody that would like to sign up for those, and we're delighted to do that. And we'll send you some more information on the email that will come out following this today, and also a recording of today's webinar. So thank you, have a great day, and hope to see you again all very soon.